we heard from Oliver about a program that did an intervention but leveraged existing surveillance system to measure it. And then we heard from ALOC a really clever methods to utilize existing data essentially to debunk a myth that existed, that when we do all this scale up, it's going to be detrimental. So these are the things that we just heard about in this session. So I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions or comments. I think Elvin put together really a nice sequence of questions during the sessions. And the question that he posed for us in this session was rigorous learning from doing ? So I now would open it up to the audience for questions. No,
I'm not addressing your question, Ellen. I thought what Diane said as a way to summarize this is in fact the essence of this, not the data issue. So a question that I have for Eran is, do you really think, and then both Oliver and Alok can certainly comment on it, but do you think that we really can get away without de novo data collection and be able to evaluate studies? And I mean, like, it's really cool that we use SmartCare, right? But how hard was that to use? And how good was it?
I think there are enough examples of very high quality data registries. Obviously, in many settings it takes investment in infrastructure. DHS has done a remarkable work in improving their data quality and doing things in a very harmonized way. They've learned from doing over a long period of time. There's obviously improvements to be made, but I think it's a very solid foundation for getting data that is has a decent data generating process and a lot of quality checks. Their methods for HIV testing, they're all sort of harmonized and using dried blood spots and getting laboratory confirmation for any positives. So I think that the answer is it's pretty good quality now, and it's good enough for, so when you have very large populations for measuring important outcomes. The other thing I would say is that when you have very large questions, it's very important to have these large samples and large populations. So.
Can I follow up on that question? Just push you a little bit further. That you're a person with many questions. Tell us an example of when. Like, what are the limitations of it? Because clearly it's great for questions. You've shown that and what you've done, but I think Nancy was pushing us a little bit. Like, when do you come up against the wall? Maybe even a specific example would be great for the audience.
Yeah. So there are a few things, that we sort of come up again and again. One is the fact that, To date, these data have been collected every 5 years or so, and so if you want to go back, to know what happened since between, let's say, 2000 in the past 10 years or so, it's going to be hard to do that, and so there's lots of there are lots of holes in the history, the other thing I would say is that you have a lot of you have sometimes like parts of the country that are just hard to get to, and so sometimes if you have particular populations, particular areas that you really want to make sure that you get, those will take a unique effort that to date it's just been we're just going to canvass the country and get a representative sample.
But sorry.
Yeah,
I promise this will be last.
No.
But you're also faced with repeat cross-sectional surveys, right? So aren't there? I mean, sometimes you need longitudinal data. The reason why I think that's important to say out loud is because PEPFAR now, as I'm sure you know, is putting gazillions of dollars into repeat cross-sectional surveys everywhere, and then using that data to evaluate programs. And
Right. So and you see that sometimes when you have these repeat cross sections, when you try to measure the same quantity, you'll see differences. So it's repeat cross section doesn't mean that they're both perfectly representative in the same way. So I think it's a fair enough point, and the FIAs are very costly. I think there was a way actually even to again like embed FIAs with
No,
existing
you're right.
infrastructure
It's
and
amazingly expensive.
anyways.
Can I just a very quick follow-up on that? I was just going to say that, so thank you for raising it and a great response, and just to, to make sure we're careful as well, that just having, for example, changes in the representativeness of your cross-section is one challenge, but obviously there's other challenges just in the sense that we don't have longitudinal data on the same people. So everything from mortality in a cohort, linkage to care outcomes, HIV incidence, depending how you feel about Rita's, all of that is, and so I'm in no way, I think DHS is an amazing resource. I think it's really exciting, perhaps going forward to think about how do we integrate the data sources. So don't reinvent the wheel. If we have a good data source, where do we really need augmented data, and can we be efficient about that? I think is an exciting frontier.
So I came across an interesting editorial in, I think it was either Science or Nature, and it was done by a bunch of Ugandan academics, many of whom we know. Francis Rajinuri was on it, Nelson Sevakombo, pushing back against this like open data idea. I think that there's this movement, some journals like PLOS Medicine are asking people to submit an entire data set when they publish a paper. Other journals are headed in that direction. The NIH has a statement about data sharing. But I think that is a huge, there are huge benefits to it, obviously, right? Like, you put the data out there, people do creative things for it, you learn things, the world gets to be a better place. But what they were pushing back against was the idea that, in a global environment where the playing field is not equal, if you make data sets from the global south open, the people who will benefit from it, from an academic or scholarly perspective, may be people from the global north. And I thought that was an interesting counterpoint, and it introduces like some complexity to this idea that we'll just all make data access open, and everybody will do better, and the world will be a better place. So I think that's just something to perhaps
So
think
given
about.
that, did they say it wasn't worth doing that?
No, they did. So they came down by saying that they thought that it should be done, but it needed to be done with like the right governance,
Got it.
rather than that it shouldn't be done.
Yeah.
Although in private, well, I mean, they didn't write that, but it could be that maybe more guarded opinions were that they have reservations with that. But yeah.
I'll even sort of go on top of that and say that we're so concerned about data protection for people who live in the U.S. If you try to get data sets, that you can barely get a smidgen of anything that will let you know anything personal about individuals. And you go to data sets from Uganda or from Kenya, and you can get down to the village that where and the church that they go to, and right, and so there's something to be said about just, again, like being cognizant of what are we doing that's sort of inequitable, and what are we doing that is sort of we're applying sort of different standards, and as well as who benefits from that. That said, I think the general direction should be towards everything being more open, but that's my personal sense of that.
Elvin, I know you and I have talked a lot about timed ART start, rapid ART start, clinical trials, experience that's happening in the field. Can you just comment on your thoughts about like methods that should be? We talked about this morning about learning while you're doing, and this is a little bit what this is supposed to be about. I think Oliver did a beautiful job just describing what's happened, and honestly, just like all the people on the panel, people from all over the world are coming to San Francisco, seeing how we're doing this, and they're adapting it. So I think we feel like perhaps we're not right there methodologically of things we could do from the data. Do you want to just comment on things that you think are low-hanging fruit or aspirational?
Thanks. So, thanks for that question. Let me know if I'm off track, because but I think that, so one of the things that's really great about sort of secondary or public data sets like this is that, people, your exposures may be at sort of a semi-macroscopic level, right? Like a change in policy, or an implementation of a program, or the amount of funding that goes to a country from PEPFAR. Then you have kind of like you have sort of distal outcomes, like how many people started, or how many people are retained. But what you often, or I think almost always are missing from these publicly available data sets are the implementation outcomes, for lack of I think different people refer to these types of things differently. So Oliver, when you were talking about Rapid, I was interested in sort of like, you did detailing, right? So how many people went out and did detailing,
Right.
and how many people got detailed, and like how many times?
Right.
And it was interesting that, I thought it was very interesting that public sector, basically it looked to me like the public sector picked this up faster than the private sector. And we've seen that in other places, like people have done studies of stuff in India, right? And the public sector generally picks up evidence-based stuff better than the private sector. It's because there's sort of an organizational structure and a social network in the public sector, and the private sector is very clustered. But how did Rapid influence all of those things, and the kinds of resources that were brought to bear to start people on the same day, for example? I would think of those as kind of like implementation outcomes that would be informative for other places and people, right? Like, not necessarily how many people started, but what it took to start.
So you're talking about the process, basically.
Well,
It's important to describe how these things are actually done.
Yeah, and I think the construct is that, so oftentimes you set out to do something,
Right.
But it may or may not be really, really clearly conceptualized, especially in real world settings. But then, in what ways did you do what you intended to do? In what ways did that adapt? And in what ways did it not happen that way? And maybe for better or for worse?
Okay, so do you want to know what I really think happened? I think that you cannot discount the effect of personal professional relationships on the rollout of Rapid in San Francisco. And that is a difficult programmatic intervention to implement, and it's difficult to measure. And I can tell you more specifically what I mean, but
that's a great, important scientific finding, in my opinion. And there are lots of ways to get at it. One is through qualitative stuff, right?
Right.
And qualitative methods are a great way of getting at implementation outcomes, particularly unintended ones,
Yeah.
because you obviously can't prepare to measure something you don't know is going to happen. But there are, we heard a lot about sort of networks, earlier today, and there are potentially ways of, sort of surveys to look at whose opinion about what was what, and whether it changed, and who their network was.
Mhm.
You could ask all providers in San Francisco one question: whose opinions about sort of a clinical innovation do you most value? Give us a
Right.
name. One person. And it might be that Rapid spread through that network, just like obesity spread through that Framingham network,
Right.
just like smoking cessation spread through, that same network. I mean, that's obviously an investment. You're not going to get this out of surveillance data, but it could be that, this would be, anyway.
That's
I'll
great.
stop.
No, perfect, thank you. Okay, we could keep going, but I just want to give a big round of applause to the panelists for some great talks. And thank you very much to the audience.